series, which will be on climate proofing Indus Water Treaty. So, which will be delivered by Dr. Ali Tauqeer Sheikh. Um, Dr. Ali is known as popular for being entrepreneur, and he is best for founding and heading Pakistan's leadership for environment and development program. So, and he is the environmental expert and served as the Asian director of Climate and Development Knowledge Network. Before earning a graduate degree in international relations from the University of Miami, he studied at a number of other institutions of higher learning, including Australian National University and Qaeda University, Islamabad, Pakistan. His lead organization was created to ensure environmentally sound economic development. We are honored to have you, sir. Over to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's my privilege to speak on such an important issue that will have bearing for our growing population, growing vulnerability, both in terms of poverty and climate vulnerability. And if I have to mention that, which is an important consideration, and our economic well-being as a society, as a civilization. And the presentation will be on a topic that is still sensitive: how to climate-proof Pakistan-India water relations. And in Pakistan, there's generally a mindset that the treaty has served us well, and we cannot secure a better treaty from India in the changed circumstances. Therefore, it's best to avoid talking about it so that there are no controversies generated. This kind of timidity results from many, many years of weak scholarship in our society on water issues. I think we need to have the courage to ask questions and then struggle for answers, and answers are not always easy. And it will take perhaps many, many years or decades to have reasonably plausible, workable answers. My only one assumption that I'll try to explain during this presentation, that India-Pakistan water relations have become more complex and they go beyond the Indus Water Treaty. Therefore, we need to have new instruments to manage our waters. And it's more important, perhaps it's important for both countries, but perhaps as a Pakistani, I would say perhaps more important for Pakistan, because we rely on waters that come to us from our neighbors. They come to us from Iran, they come to us from Afghanistan, they come to us from China, and they come to us from India. And most of our waters are transboundary waters. The reason I'm saying that these are very important is that the assumptions that we had at the time of signing of treaty were that the world will probably not change and water quality will not be an issue, water quantity will not be an issue, and system operations will not be a fundamental issue, and that new governance institutions will not be required. So we set up certain institutions 50 or 70 years ago when we signed the treaty. We still have the same institutions. We have not raised issue about the quality and quantity, except in accusatory terms, not in problem-solving mode. And then we have not looked at the system of operation. So many of the assumptions that we had at the time are changing, and those changes are accelerating because of climatic changes. And of course, other factors such as growing population, growing consumption habits, growing urbanization, more water-intensive agriculture, and changing cropping patterns. But more importantly, from climate change perspective, because of increased temperatures and changing patterns of monsoon, precipitation factors. Many of these assumptions need to be revisited. Now, when we speak about India-Pakistan water relations, we assume as if these are the only two countries that have shared waters. That's not the case. We need to inform ourselves and our policymakers about this much more, that there are hundreds of countries. And when I say hundreds, I'm not saying proverbially. Actually, there are hundreds of countries that share hundreds of rivers. And then there are hundreds of agreements also that govern water relations. So it's not something unique. It's not that India and Pakistan came down to this earth from heaven and they have some unique problem. We need to learn what is happening elsewhere in the world. What are the major trends in these water agreements that the countries have amongst themselves. But generally speaking, the macro question that I can frame for today, there are two ways to look at. Are we subservient to sovereign, or sovereign is subservient to ecosystem needs? And these are important questions. In many countries, we have a very distinguished professor from us, I assume from Germany, where the shared water, which was very contested only a few decades ago, has become a lifeline of prosperity for many societies and many sectors of the economy. It has become an emblem of peace and cooperation. So the question is, how do we handle the sensitivity of a developing country's sovereignty, which think is supreme, and which considers ecosystems as subservient? That's an old-fashioned, outmoded thinking, and we need to upgrade our softwares a little bit. And why I'm saying outdated, outmoded, I'm using stronger words to communicate my message to the audience. I don't know what kind of people are listening, in addition to very distinguished gentlemen that I can see, is that this was an imperial Stalinist or British Empire feeling that you construct infrastructure wherever you can, zigzag the ecosystems, connect rivers without having any sensitivity for ecology, ecosystems and species, and their right to life and their right to survival and their contribution towards overall broader environment. So we are breathing in that tradition whereby there are only two types of people now in this part of the world. One is engineers. They look at water and they think of engineering solutions, more reservoirs, more structures, more interventions, more intrusive interventions on river bodies, be they canals, be they rivers, be they whatever, urban water passages. Or there are those who are considered an outsiders outside of the system, who think in environmental terms, ecology terms, or ecosystem terms. And this division is reflected of sovereign versus ecosystem approaches towards river systems, such as Indus. And those who are thinking in terms of emerging existential threats such as climate change, they are very keen to see that how these 300 agreements, transboundary water agreements that exist in the world today, how they are being revisited to adjust to some of the climate challenges. And since the climate challenge is unfolding, there are no ready-made answers. In many cases, we'll have to be very procedurally driven, very receptive to new changes, and have the agility to adjust to new trends. I just want to explain to you that point a little bit. Most of the agreements, and I'm not an expert to know all of them, but the major agreements think in terms of sharing rivers whereas the Indus Water Treaty is based on dividing rivers. The treaty specifically divides not only rivers, but the quantities of waters. So some of the new trends that are emerging is that the quantities are changing. And now that we have signed a treaty, it has an article, Article 7, which I think is the heart of this treaty, which the engineers have ignored. And that article has the provisions to deal with the set of issues that have emerged in recent years, such as climate change, just as the quality of water, such as the quantity of water, and such as new contemporary modern institutions to deal with these issues. So Article 7 in the treaty is the most promising instrument that we have, and regrettably one of the least used instruments. I don't know, for whatever reasons, India and Pakistan are so averse to thinking about water research in each other's countries, let alone the collaborative research. So we can have probably parallel research projects on some of these issues. We can have many exchanges of academic and track 2 or whatever nature to see what is happening in the other country. Because the bottom line is very simple, and I'll explain that bottom line very simple. Once we divided the rivers, Indian side had the challenge to provide water to Kashmir, at least the part that is governed by India, to Delhi, to a new state that was carved out of Punjab province, Punjab state in India, Haryana, and beyond in Rajasthan. So almost half of India's water, Punjab's specific water, was diverted out of Punjab's. This resulted in very acute shortages in the Indian Punjab. You can blame it to treaty, which many farmers would do, or politicians would do, or you can blame it to either water governance or the new agricultural demands that were emerging. And what were the emerging demands? I don't often remember all the districts in India. Probably there are, whatever their number is, most of them are categorized as acutely water shortage districts. And that's where they are growing paddy, rice. On the one hand, the debate is that it's a very, very scarce, water scarce area. On the other hand, the agriculture practices are such that are very water intensive. The water input has become very central in many areas. And then not just that, if you wish to have strawberries or cucumbers or other water intensive areas living in Mumbai or in Kerala or elsewhere, probably Indian Punjab is growing it for you in Kashmir and Punjab areas because of that in that water scarce region. So the groundwater pumping together with water intensive cropping pattern results in increased scarcity, and that scarcity becomes very politicized because then the downstream water supply also shrinks, except during monsoon, and that then you're trying to capture by constructing a very elaborate network of water reservoirs and dams. And India's present design is probably several dozen, 70 or 80 or more than 70, 80 water reservoirs are designed in the river systems of India, not just on this one. So then we are driven by engineering solutions that we have solutions for these problems. We can capture monsoon water and we can overcome the scarcity, then looking at managing the demand side. And that story is not exclusively India's story. Regrettably, Pakistan is doing exactly the same. And therefore, the problems of scarcity are understandable, but we can understand them better if we study each other's country. I often used to say, and probably I'll still say, that if a tap is leaking in Indian Punjab and water is being wasted there, it results in water scarcity in Pakistan. And then I'm criticized that you seem to have a very imperial approach. Are you trying to exercise some right over India's water? And I'm saying, no, I'm trying to understand the practices that result in scarcity. So therefore, coming back to this issue, looking at scarcity, looking at the new formulas, new approaches that are evolving in other parts of the world become very important. And those are not very absolutely alien to South Asia also. The water treaty between Bangladesh and India, Ganges Water Treaty, is a beautiful example of several elements that can be tackled under Article 7 of the Indus Water Treaty. They have a joint water commission. It supports the bilateral treaty with the studies and reports, oversharing waters, irrigation, floods, and cyclone controls. It's a relatively new treaty compared to India-Pakistan treaty, but I believe that having provision for joint researches on such issues that are now becoming at the center or heart of climate change are important issues for a new for India and Pakistan to look at and design instruments to develop those. And this Treaty of India is India-Bangladesh is not probably the perfect, and probably its functioning on data sharing is not always perfect. The data sharing provision of sharing real life data is not always adhered to, and sometimes there are additional issues that I may or may not be aware of. But the point is that the direction of the journey is extremely healthy. And there are some lessons for us to build upon to see that. Similarly, I think the Permanent Joint Technical Commission on the Nile Basin, where the Millennium Water Reservoir has created big controversies. But I see silver linings there. And the silver linings are from, as a Pakistani, several. One, which is one of the most important ones, is that the downstream countries such as Nile were negotiating the design of the reservoir upstream. Now here in India-Pakistan case, there's more arbitrariness than agreeing on a design upstream. Most of Indian infrastructural construction was objected by Pakistan, saying that it violates the treaty. And most of Pakistani objections were rejected by India by saying that no, we are adhering to the treaty. And that's a very good thing to say, that we are adhering to the treaty. But having said that, there was never an agreement on the design of the infrastructure. Whereas the lesson that I'm trying to draw from River Nile is that many countries upstream and downstream became parties to the design and parties to the timing of its filling to avoid downstream scarcity and drought. And even there have been discussions in generating electricity that others could also utilize. So going beyond, and not that it was easy to do, international community played a very important role in these conversations, which were suspended many a times. Many a times there was a bickering and disagreements, and they never concluded something jointly. But many a times it added to the sensitivity of addressing those issues. And those who were even rejecting the argument developed an appreciation of the other side's argument. But very important is that the Joint Technical Commission uh, has the ability, has the mandate to make recommendations for new water allocations in response to extraordinary drought, uh, which is absolutely refreshing, because droughts and climate change have become synonymous in many parts of the region, including India and Pakistan. We're experiencing many more droughts now than we did. The incidence of droughts has increased, or is increasing, I should say. And droughts are more easily attributable to climate change than floods. Floods are oftentimes a failure of governance, and we are intellectually lazy and claim them as climate result. So not all extreme weather events are easily attributable to climate change, but droughts are. So in other words, we need to gear up for managing the anticipated scarcity rather than just dividing the water that is presently available and that has begun to fluctuate a lot more, partly because of climate change and partly because of our domestic agriculture practices and partly because of variation in climate change. What does that mean? It means that present management systems and structure that the two countries have adopted is not always in sync with new practices that are emerging or that are needed and that are flexible water management strategies. So we need to build in our water relation, if I may say so, flexible management strategies than being static. Because the assumptions are changing. I just wish to submit one example. India-Pakistan Permanent Commission has a commissioner from Indian side, and we have a commissioner from India side. The treaty says that they will meet at least twice a year. For the most part, they have met twice a year. But the treaty says minimum twice a year. And we are interpreting that maximum twice a year. If it's a robust treaty, it needs to have robust mechanisms in place. Treaty does not forbid us from having working groups on these issues that I just mentioned, or many more. There are several issues mentioned in the treaty, such as river pollution. And River Ravi, that is in Pakistan, is specifically mentioned in the pollution context. But the Commission has wasted or invested last 4 decades or 5 decades on objecting to each other's infrastructure. Then having flexible management strategies and utilizing the treaty provisions fully. It's suboptimally utilized treaty provisions that I am referring to. More importantly, because the assumptions have begun to change. Assumptions are not given, and the commissioner's offices need to have subgroups and subcommittees involving other stakeholders. By the way, the treaty is such a detailed treaty, and I admire the people who wrote it. It even gave the qualification of the commissioners, which to me showed the understanding that existed at the time, and that the mindset of British Raj I mentioned to you, that was very similar at the same time by the Stalinist major huge projects in Central Asia and elsewhere. And that said, commissioners will ideally be engineers, water engineers. And we took ideally as a requirement. So both sides have been appointing engineers. And I've tried to engage at least the Pakistani side. But then why don't you look at geographers? Why don't you look at private sector chief executives? If you really want to solve some problems, then you need to have a different mindset and you need to avail the flexibilities that are available in the. But the government of Pakistan, I don't know if I can say that or not, instead of availing that position, would wait for several years to appoint someone and keep that position vacant and have ad hoc arrangements because no well-qualified engineer is available to them to head this commission. So if our assumptions are changing, so should the traits and the personalities of the managers. Now, I want to wrap it up by making 2 or 3 main points and then elaborate. Now, if the assumptions are changing, I would like to submit that there are 4 or 5 things that are very important to me, and I hope it's a difficult political relationship. There's not lots of space available to speak about water issues. And that is precisely the reason that I feel the urgency. The situation will become even more complex if we keep it on the back burner. Everything around us highlights the urgency. We just talked about population and consumption pattern and urbanization and accelerating climate change trends. But many of the extreme weather events need for India and Pakistan to devise response strategies, particularly in floods, droughts, tropical storms, and cloud outbursts. Cloud outbursts have created havoc in India, in Dehradun, in Pakistan, in Nowshera, and in Indian held Kashmir and downstream in Pakistani city Sialkot. The phenomena, because of climatic or other trends, is increasing. Tropical storms were very rare in the Arabian Sea. Their frequency and ferocity has begun to increase. And they cover the coastline from Karachi to Bombay. That itself is 500 million people, perhaps, I don't know, in that stretch. So tropical storms and seawater intrusion and the encroaching salinity and erosion of coastline has become a very major issue, a water issue, not just a climate change issue. Incidence of drought, even in the snow-capped mountainous areas, has increased. And that results in more frequent landslides. Very little data is available on landslides. And there are huge discrepancies on data between what NASA has calculated and what World Bank studies have calculated. Huge. And it's not easy, but typically the victims are always poor people in fragile ecosystems who live on slopes. Their school and hospital systems are on those slopes. Their housing and other infrastructure in those slopes. Floods we often talk, mostly in Pakistan, but we don't always talk about urban flooding. The incidence of urban flooding has increased. We speak occasionally about torrential rains, but we don't often understand the flash floods between Balochistan and Sindh and between Punjab and Balochistan and so on and so forth. But what we don't understand, what we don't talk about very often are the heat waves. We think it's only in the plains of Punjab or Sindh. And because we had a major heat wave some years ago in Karachi, we think it's only a southern Pakistan issue. Heat waves in upper Indus Basin are increasing the shrinking or accelerating the shrinking of glaciers. In fact, the glacial melt because of heat waves in Afghanistan gives us early water in Pakistan. When water, Pakistan is very, very scarce because of water resources. That's when we start getting water from Afghanistan, attributable to heat, early heat, and now increasingly heat waves. So increase in temperature without heat waves and increased temperature as a new normal plus heat waves are giving us in upper Indus Basin. We see all of a sudden that Pakistan's area in Gilgit and Baltistan have become hubs of flooding. Gloves are becoming a household word in some ways. So therefore, I think there's a space for us, for these two countries, to jointly study in our respective countries the phenomena of extreme weather events, which are becoming much more frequent. Second, I think we need to review water quality standards and arrest water degradation. That has become particularly detrimental for existing and future infrastructure. We create many more reservoirs and infrastructure, and they get filled very quickly, and their lifespans are shrinking, and we're constantly struggling how to keep them operational. And this is an issue that both countries need to think. I think there's need for us to explore changes in monitoring and review procedures to jointly deliberate the shared climate concerns to enhance effectiveness of Indus Water Treaty. Climate change did not exist. In fact, water treaty is only a water treaty. It's not a treaty. There's no word environment used in the Indus Water Treaty. There's no notion of environmental flows or minimum flows. It does not use the word ecosystem. So it was written in a different time scale. We cannot blame them with the knowledge that we have today. Human knowledge has increased tremendously in the last 5 decades, but it did not exist at that time. So even if there was no climate change, the environmental knowledge has increased so much. So we need to have review procedures revisited. And finally, what I wanted to say is strengthening joint management institutions. We don't have any. We are using suboptimally the one that we have. And when the institutions fail, the nations fail. And unless we begin to invest in our institutions, we cannot respond to many of these questions. If I have to strengthen one institution in this country, in the water context, I'll say it's our water study center or water institution commissioner's office that need to have those capacities to look at the issue, not in the paragraphs of water treaty, but the challenges that have surfaced since then. And I want to give you just one example, and I'll wrap up on this one. The mindset in both countries is that hydro energy is the cheapest energy available to us, and we are the right to use maximum water. And when we say right to use maximum water, India says no drop of water should escape to Pakistan and constrain infrastructure. And Pakistan says that no drop of water should go to the Arabian Sea, even if the absence of flow in the Arabian Sea would mean that we are not able to protect ourselves from seawater intrusion and cannot protect our mangroves. So these are the mindset within which we operate. But we think that every drop of water should be used for energy, and we call it hydro energy. Even if that means that we ruin in the process the ecosystem and the river's right to survive. They need to have their own depth. They need to have their own shoulders. They need to have their own flow. We don't need to block and obstruct that wherever we can at will, and we do. And today I can argue this case that probably solar has become much cheaper than hydro. India and Pakistan's growing energy needs need to be met, of course, and we need to find out what are other sources available. And hydro, the mindset that hydro is the only solution, we need to question that to find out if it can help us save the ecosystems. I conclude with these some questions that I have in my mind. So I accept that we have more questions than answers, but it's an opportunity I wanted to avail to provoke a conversation and learn from you gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I have a pencil. Take notes.
Okay, thank you.
Speak louder.
Yes.
Yes. Now you can.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. It's a nice and detailed talk. Now the floor is open for questions. We have a question from Qasim Jamsab, one of the organizers. Sir, can you unmute your mic and ask your question, please? Ji, Qasim Jamsab.
May I?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank our friend, my dear friend, Tauqeer Sheikh Sahib, for giving us some very wonderful sides of the issue, and we should think about those. It's in this context I want to make two comments. One is that when you said that the commission member from Pakistan is invariably engineer, this is very unfortunate, not because I'm against engineers, but quite honestly, for an important assignment, the person should have knowledge of that particular activity in which he or she is going to represent Pakistan or any country. We have a problem, similar problem in the mineral sector. I'm a geologist, so I can talk about that more. That in mineral sector, invariably, the boss to take decisions is not a geologist or a mining engineer. It's some civil servant. We have that problem there also. So that's one thing. When you are writing a paper for us, and I'm sure you would be you would be kindly contributing one. This is a point that should be raised loudly, that we need experts to do the correct jobs. The second is that, as you mentioned, India, Pakistan obviously need to sit together and look at the treaty in the context of changes in the environment and ecosystem over the past 50 years. But one of the big problems in both countries, as you already mentioned, and I wish to repeat it, is that we have a lack of trust. When India takes initiative, invariably in Pakistan we're shivering. This is aimed at damaging Pakistan. Same thing is happening in the in India. That when we take some initiative, jobs having some bearing in India, they think that it's anti-India. I think that the time has come that two countries develop an understanding that we are not going to fight any more wars. The time for the war is over. It's time that we jointly sit together and try to find solutions to our problems. With that, once again, I thank you, Tauqeer Sahib, for a wonderful talk. Thank you indeed.
I agree with your sentiments, but I want to allow me to share some reflection on trust. Trust is the name of a process. And the process is a brick by brick by brick process. And it covers many, many sectors. And we need to constantly struggle and identify where are more additional sectors that can help us build that trust. And trust is an outcome of transactions at human level, at professional and institutional level. When you create barriers and you do not interact, the mistrust increases. I want to give you two small examples with a difference of about, I think, 40 years. My first interaction with an Indian was a very eminent Indian military strategist. His name was K. Subramaniam. You Google and you'll see that he wrote hundreds of, and during Mrs. Gandhi's time and beyond, he was one of the most influential Indian minds on defense and foreign policy. I was junior officer just starting my career, and I was invited to a dinner where he was the guest. And that was my first interaction. And I was sitting at the end of the table as junior most officer. And with something I'll never forget. And this was General Zia's time. We had just begun to Islamize ourselves. We were under military dictator at the time. And he accepted steak. And our mindset was, he's coming from India, he's Hindu, he's a vegetarian, and he cannot have a steak. And our second mindset, and his mindset that he revealed, that was our mindset that we revealed. And his mindset that he revealed, there were some women there who were not wrapped up in veil. And that was his understanding, that how come women are sitting on this table. This was the difference between our perceptions. And he was a very eminent person. Even today, sometimes I try to find some of his old writing with delight because of his influence. That's the perception, how can we have a trust if we make our policy recommendations based on this kind of communication. And the second example I want to give is 50 years later, probably a few months ago, when I had the opportunity to meet French ambassador. And he had invited a young officer who was a foreign office officer from Germany on secondment to the French embassy. And I was somewhat taken aback, and I said, well, it's very unusual for a serving German officer to be sitting in the French embassies. And then I had a conversation with the ambassador, and he said, no, this is our trust building process. It covers all walks of life, 100 and 1,000 scholarships. Even on foreign policy issues, we depute officers to each other and ensure that that's a trust building process. So in these 40 or 50 years of two examples that I gave you, absence of war cannot happen unless there is an interaction. Otherwise accident. Peace is an accident. War is not accident. If there's no interaction, we are preparing for war. We may or may not like to accept that, but our minds are such that we have killed the processes that cannot be denied, should not be denied. And I know when I say water, people say, oh, there are more important issues. There isn't anything more important issue than peace building process or trust building process. And that begins from that kind of interaction that I saw at the ambassador's place, or that I saw 50 years ago at another dinner table. So the question is how open we are to say that all Pakistani universities will accept Indian students and all Indian universities can accept Pakistani students, and then there will be large number of scholarships to encourage that, and the visa facilities are made easier. And then in tourism and in so many other sectors, in economy, agriculture, water usage, urban planning, there's no area on which we are not similar to each other to learn from each other. So sorry for this long answer, but because there are younger people in this on this table, I wanted to emphasize. Right now, we are preparing for a war by creating barriers. And this is a war that has, the Pakistani economy has never recovered from 1965 war. Professor Qasim Jan, you know more than anybody else. Today, we are in a position, economic or social, that triggered with 1965 war. When we were wounded, our economy was wounded, and since then, our economy has never come back on track. So responsibility, I want to say this, since Bob is here, also falls on India. I hold my country fundamentally responsible, because we cannot allow India to do what Reagan did with Russia. You don't force arms race on the weaker side for that to collapse. That's a very risky business. Luckily, the transition happened peacefully. But sometimes I feel that India deliberately keeps us on our toe, and we divert our resources. And a country that had an economy that was faster and stronger than India's has become a very hollow in a hub of terrorism and all the problems associated. Sorry about this long answer, but my apologies for a long answer.
Okay,
Hello.
Judy, go ahead, please.
Okay. We have another question from Bob, one of the organizers of the webinar series. Bob, you can ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you, Benazir, for organizing. Dr. Tauqeer Sheikh, a very interesting talk, and wonderful to hear your perspective on these transboundary water challenges, which I agree 100% a global issue. Hundreds of countries are involved with these kinds of challenges. I wanted to explore further you mentioned briefly there is a collaborative arrangement between India and Bangladesh on the waters of the Brahmaputra. And I'm curious to learn more about how that arrangement has been working over the years, and if there are some possible learnings or good practices or best practices that could be drawn upon from that collaborative relationship that could be brought over to the Indus side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The water issues between Bangladesh and Pakistan predate creation of Bangladesh. Farkha Barrage became the major sore point between the two countries. And 70 years later, the state of Bihar demands from the union government in India to demolish Farkha Barrage because it results in inundation and flooding in Bihar. For various factors, Farkha Barrage may or may not be demolished. I have no view or particular preference on that sense. But a direct implication is twofold. One is that because of flooding, the state of Bihar has spent or invested billions on what we call adaptation to protect communities and settlements from inundation. I visited some to only find that it was less of adaptation and more of adaptation because the river body changes its course. Its tributaries change their course. And there is like the place is littered with useless infrastructure on which the government has been investing. So the water resources can bleed the state of Bihar by requiring more and more infrastructural investments. And for the federal government to get sufficient votes elsewhere, if they lose Bihar's vote, if Farkha Barrage demolition becomes a popular issue, probably so far it's not, then it will be very hard for any union government to be in Delhi in their union government without necessarily winning sufficient seats outside Bihar. So it has become an issue, water issue has become an issue that will have bearing on the domestic politics as well as India's growth rate. Bihar is a very, very large and very important economic entity for India's economic development, and as Pakistanis, we wish them to develop. The conversations that have led to this treaty, a precursor was about 20 years of a joint commission. And these were academic and research exchanges. These were the people, retired policymakers as well. These were the people who became personal friends of each other because of their intense interactions, trust building we just talked about. They began to develop empathy towards a set of issues. And that fed into the provisions of the treaty that they signed. Actual signing of treaty may have been motivated by political reasons as well. But the bottom-up pressure was coming from this joint commission, which was called Permanent Commission, which had done good amount of work over 2 decades. I had the opportunity of seeing some of it, but most of it probably I have not. But the very important element that I guess in my interactions was the personal respect and relationships that they developed, the trust that fed into the treaty. Right now, we don't have that. I don't want to reflect on that side again and again because I've talked sufficiently about this. But the lesson that I have is that the Indus Water Permanent Commission, Indus, whatever that's called, the Commissioner's Office, Indus Commission Office, lacks not only in vision or personnel on their TORs and so on and so forth, or subcommittees, but also lacks in their ability to interact with each other. They have made it into a checklist of meeting twice for a 2-day meeting and coming back with a non-statement that doesn't tell you much. We exchange documents and we meet again, and more or less. There are no other stakeholders that are trusted to share. And I demand from them every now and then that engage other stakeholders before every meeting, brief them after every meeting. And in fact, if you want to learn lessons from Dombe or other river instrument, make other stakeholders sit as observers in the meetings. Inform them so that they are able to advise subsequently when they are capacitated. Excuse me. So I think some of these things went well in Bangladesh case. I don't know if I've answered your question or if you have some other dimension in mind that I should try to reflect on.
No, I appreciate it. I think it's instructive for us to look at other examples. You mentioned also the Nile River drainage and the discussions about the Millennium Dam. And I think that we all can learn from each other. And I speak from the United States point of view. We're struggling with water treaties right now on the Colorado River. Our negotiations between states and, of course, between the United States and Mexico. These are ongoing issues, especially today in a time of, we call it aridification. It's a long-term drought. And so I think that it's interesting for me to observe the challenges that you're describing because they're not unique to Pakistan and India. I think that there are more challenges in common than we might easily appreciate. And I think that it would be interesting to broaden our discussion and to learn more about success cases around the world. And I think that that's something we can all learn from, and maybe take this opportunity based on your presentation to explore other mechanisms, such as you discuss, broadening the participation in the biannual meetings. Your comment about ecosystem services, very relevant today worldwide. Lots of people focusing now on the value of maintaining ecosystems. Earlier seminars, we've talked about the delta region of the Indus River, where it reaches the Arabian Sea, and the fact that it's a prerequisite to the life of the people in that delta area to have the survival of the ecosystems. So again, thank you for your presentation and your perspectives.
Well, I wish to learn from you and other colleagues on this. Two examples are absolutely stunning. One is direct US experience, and I hope you will reflect a little bit on this, is the Columbia River Treaty with Canada. From Pakistan's point of view, what was important that I observed, it's a process of almost a century now, starting in 1930s. And at the time, it seemed like a sellout by the Canadians. But now it means $700–800 million annual revenue that they get. Your agreements on not polluting waters is a shining example in managing healthy ecosystems of waters. And this was very visionary. And some of the instruments of Columbia River Treaty, I'm not alert to them. It has been a while, but they are very robust. The frequency is very admirable, and the number of issues covered is remarkable. And the approach, actually, this is the point that I wanted to draw from this, is win-win, not any game theory of Cold War-like situation that one side must lose. So the win-win propositions have resulted in make the treaty a functioning document for over a century. And over a period of time, several new instruments have been added. You did not allow the Columbia River Treaty to become static. New data sharing mechanisms, new data sharing technologies, new exchange of information kept the trust high and kept the treaty going. And that is an outsider's view. You are, of course, an expert. You'll tell us a lot more. And second example, which is much more relevant, I think, in Pakistani-India context, is Turkey-Armenia Water Cooperation, despite their tensions. We all know that since the genocide in Armenia in 1928 or something, both countries do not recognize each other. They don't even have diplomatic relations. At times there is a tension. And those tensions are very comparable to India-Pakistan tension, even though in our case, we are lucky in that we have at least diplomatic relations and a treaty. But in their case, starting with the Soviets several decades ago, they started water cooperation that continues today. And the lesson there was data sharing and giving autonomy. Lesson for me, and others can draw their different lessons. What I wanted to say was giving autonomy and power to local commissioners who meet very regularly. They may not be diplomatic relations, but they have firewalled the exchange of information and scientific exchange of instruments. So it's in that sense the Turkey-Armenia case is absolutely revealing for India-Pakistan. Just a quick, I was part of a case study that was developed on this for MIT lit subsequently. And I don't have all the instruments handy in my mind, but it is absolutely important to see that how you can firewall the commission. In our case, that's a lesson for us, for them to create space for them, for the commissioners to work. In our case, the commissioners are not professionals. They have become subservient to political climate. Then professionals cannot deliver their work unless you give them their space, respect for their space. Incidentally, since you mentioned this, I should also mention Kabul River Basin between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It is oftentimes assumed that it is only a mini basin of Indus, which is also correct. But when I was growing up, when I was younger, I was oftentimes told that Indus Water Treaty is a model. There's no such treaty between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Indus Water Treaty can serve as a model for Pakistan and Afghanistan. And some years ago, when I started my work on Afghanistan, on the treaty issues, I think I am not comfortable with that notion, and I think this is a clean slate. We don't have to be a prisoner of the water experience that we have with India. It's a clean slate. We can write whatever we wish to write. And it's only the absence of trust that the two sides have not moved forward. Otherwise, willingness is there on both sides to have an agreement of some sort. And we need to probably think that despite political situation that exists in two countries, we need to have institutions in place that begin to monitor water quality. That is, by the way, just to give you one example how critical it is, when we speak about Afghanistan, Pakistan water, it's about 15-18% of Pakistan's total water. And recent resurgence of polio, the data and studies have shown that the traces are in the water of Kabul River as it approaches Nusheira. Now, I cannot solve my polio issue, no matter how hard I try, unless I also solve that in Afghanistan. And I cannot solve it in all of Afghanistan, but at least with the communities that live on both sides of the river, who pollute that. So, so our stakes are very high. It's not something that Pakistan can afford to ignore. And the impact of climate change I have already referred to. So in other words, these examples that we talked today, Nile or Brahmaputra or Colorado or Turkey, Armenia, in Kabul River Basin, they have plenty of lessons for us. And one most important lesson is continuing the discourse and dialogue, making it professional, creating space, firewalling it.
Tauqeer Sahib, you have other people who want to ask questions, so kindly be brief, and it would be nice if you can spare time to respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you. I will give short answers. Thank you for correcting.
Professor Matthias, you can ask your question, please.
Yes, well, I think most of the things have been just discussed now between Bob and our speaker. However, once more, it was an excellent, really excellent presentation and an excellent summary of the problems which are really challenging this situation. However, most of the things are known for decades now. We discuss it for decades and nothing really happens because, and you mentioned it, it's a question of trust, a question of real cooperation. And my question is, as how can we really reach such a position? Maybe, just as an example, you mentioned it as well, a lot of infrastructure is needed, for channels, for groundwater, for water quality, and so on. And this infrastructure is very expensive. So is there a chance that the donors, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and so make clear conditions? They say, okay, we provide funds, but you need what you just suggested, joint water commission, management institution, and so on. Without this, you do not get the funds. Once more, it's known nothing happens or only little happens, and both countries depend on it. So what are the means of pressure really to make a step forward?
Well, thank you. We all agree that the water treaty should not become a hostage to weak institutions. And therefore, some investment needs to go in those. I don't know about multilateral development partners in both countries. They may not be the right institution to extend long-term technical partnerships with these water-related institutions, such as the Commissioner's Office. But both in Europe and US, there's a sufficient expertise to have collaborative agreements with these institutions to build this and then host trilateral meetings for a few years to put in place a few bricks of trust. These people need to know each other. And a few baskets should be defined slowly as they were defined at the time of European Community's transformation, baskets for negotiations than just steel or something. In order to resuscitate the treaty, I believe a ministerial level commission can help us revitalize the Indus Water Treaty. Right now, it has been relegated to a secondary level through Indus Water Commissioners. And even those are engineers who have no broader vision, they just know the technical designs or objections on certain design. So the ministerial level commission can meet once or twice a year and draw attention to other aspects as well. And because they are politicians, they know how to deal with flashy cameras and media and all that, and draw attention to these things. These are two starting points that come to my mind in response to your question.
But once more, it obviously needs also some pressure without, because it's discussed for ages. I work for 30 years in Pakistan and I have heard this many, many times. It needs obviously some pressure that it is done.
Well, I need to learn from you. I think pressures will not work. Indian economy is very strong to initiate any infrastructure development without any support for any multilateral development. Mm-hmm. And on the Pakistani side, when some multilateral development institutions, MDBs, for example, refuse to comment because it falls in disputed territory, then Pakistan committed to construct those with their own resources. So pressure, yes, but I think the stick needs to be supported by, on the other hand, technical studies or science to say, to argue that water reservoirs is not the cheapest case, cheapest option. Cheapest options will now come from solar energy. Mm-hmm. And as far as the water reservoirs is concerned, for interseasonal water flows, a chain of watersheds to recharge groundwater along the length of the Indus River is an option. Already over a dozen locations have been identified. We need to have small investments to recharge those, and that charging will hopefully be more economical than big reservoirs.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we have a question from Dr. Sudesh. Can you please, Dr. Sudesh, please introduce yourself and now you can, then you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Benazir. It's a very interesting talk. Thank you, Dr. Ali. I'm from India. I'm Dr. Sudesh Wadawan, former Director General, Geological Survey of India. And at the outset, I've been listening to all the, not only your talk, but all the other panelists who are questioning. And I fully agree with Dr. Qasim Jan, who raised certain issues that, the building up of the trust has to be the primary consideration. And the political environment plus bureaucratic environment, which is actually playing a lot of decision making on either side. In fact, that should be, I think, the practice most of the places. But that is also felt as a major hurdle for one of the interesting topics that you have discussed today on impacts of climate change, which is global in nature, and these political boundaries will not help us unless we have such joint working groups to address the R&D related issues that you have very nicely raised. Now, second part, you see, this is Indus Treaty is between India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, there is a partition and the two countries are behaving and having their own political setups. But I can tell you number of good examples of such water disputes within the country, within India. Kaveri River, for example, we are having this dispute for number of decades between Karnataka state and the Tamil Nadu state. And similarly, Periyar River Basin, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And similar issues are there in a few other states wherein I think more than the scientific considerations, the political considerations are actually weighing. The politics of the, this vote bank politics is actually taking over, and sometimes even the judiciary also is involved, which is having its own play and its own role to play. But I fully agree with you that there is need for more scientific collaboration on these issues. And what I want to ask you is, whatever good parts that you have delivered today, are you in a position to convince your own government to follow these basic principles of scientific approach? These are some of the comments. I don't mean any bad things on this, but then you see this kind of bias is always there. If I speak from Indian part, I'll have my own considerations, and you are right in speaking things from Pakistan point of view. But then there are certain issues which should address the humanity in toto. The first and foremost priority for use of water is for drinking purpose. That is, I think, understood. And therefore, that is how our government is addressing these issues, to have better management on supply of drinking water to the states which are deficit in such waters. For example, Rajasthan. I'm presently, talking to you from Jaipur, Rajasthan, wherein I get water only for 1 hour a day throughout the year, because this is a water deficit state. And we are dependent on some of these rivers which bring in water from the adjoining states, which may be having surplus of water availability. So this water budgeting has to be there. And therefore, we also need to do demand and supply analysis, again, by the experts, not by the bureaucrats or the politicians. Thank you very much once again. I just spoke my mind. Please don't mind if I've spoken the things which may not be acceptable to you.
No, actually, I admire that you said in 1 or 2 minutes things that I was trying to say in 2 hours. You spoke my heart. And I fully agree with you. There's a lot for us to learn from each other. And domestic politics of water can be as vicious or perhaps even more vicious than interstate politics. So the differences between states on water issues, they get politicized, perhaps more than Indus Water Treaty. So I fully agree with you. I've followed 1 or 2 judicial cases in India that one way probably for us to think is that the Indus Water Commissioners should have 2 or 3 working groups, maybe ad hoc working groups to start with, and a small donor can give them a little bit of support for a year or two to look at the drinking water challenges, the water quality issues, or domestic challenges, or measuring, or the bottlenecks in data sharing, something of that sort to help us build a process for dialogue.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir, for spending your time, in fact, your precious time for such a detailed talk. As we have no other question from the audience and from our organizer as well, so we will end the talk, and I will request all of the participants to turn